So tell me about yourself.
Well, I am a Baal Tshuva, meaning, as you know, I wasn't raised religious, but I became religious, and that was 3 years ago. And with that, I've just been studying world religions since I was a small child, and I pride myself on being quite knowledgeable while not being a rabbi or clergy.
So your
Not
parents are Jewish?
Yes.
You didn't grow up religious at all?
No, my dad was conservative, and when he grew up, like most conservatives, after the bar mitzvah, they become practically secular. And my mother was raised secular. So,
What do you consider yourself now?
well, I'm an Orthodox Jew.
Where do you live?
I live in Brooklyn.
Awesome. Any particular branch of Orthodoxy, like Chabad or?
Actually, I'm a part of a Sephardic shul. It's mainly Syrian in nature, but I enjoy that. If I had to identify my ideology, the closest thing to it would be a Rambamist, but I'm actually a bit more traditional because I just want to go the Mishnah alone.
Mm-hmm. Is your family Ashkenazi originally or Sephardi?
Yeah, mainly they were Ashkenazi, but the Sephardic community welcomed me with open arms, and I've just been going there for 2 years now.
How would you describe a Rambamist? Because there are a few different types of Rambamists, pretty much split in half between Spanish, Portuguese, and Yemenites.
I'm close to the Yemenite type.
Mm-hmm. So you view halakha.
I believe the rationalist school of thought would be how I view halakha.
How is halakha developed?
According to my simple understanding, it mainly started when Ezra came back and reconstituted the Torah. And from there, the Great Assembly turned slowly to the Sanhedrin. And through their legal decisions, it explained the details of Jewish law.
You're saying this began with Ezra? So how about before?
Yeah. Well, before that was the pre-exile, and whatever form that took was according to Scripture, mainly from the priests and the Levites. So I don't know if there is a change, and there's no actual way of knowing, but that was the former way of doing things, and when we went back to the land, it wasn't that way, so it became the Great Assembly instead.
The Rambam, in his Hakdama to Mishnah Torah, brings down a genealogy like it appears in Pirkei Avot. And it doesn't stop at Ezra. It goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of the Masorah being passed on from court to court. Wouldn't that contradict what you just said?
Well, I don't believe the Rambam, as any rabbinical scholar as well, to be a authority on belief, because the Torah only says that they are a authority on Jewish law and how to practice it. So with that, this is where I disagree with him personally. But the only reason why I disagree is because I'm reading the Parshat of Scripture, and what I can see is the factual history by scholars on the study of the Second Temple and pre-Second Temple times.
Mm-hmm. I'm also of the opinion that our sages had really nothing authoritative to say in terms of belief, but action, as it appears in Deuteronomy chapter 17. But Parshat Shoftim, that portion in Deuteronomy chapter 17, establishes the Sanhedrin, or in Hebrew is the Beit Din HaGadol. From that moment on, as a matter of fact, it goes even further back. It appears in the book of Numbers. It appears also in the first chapter of Deuteronomy. The great court existed before they even entered the land of Israel. But in Torah, they're called the elders. And later on, they're just called the great court. And after Ezra, they're called the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And then after that, they're called the Sanhedrin. But it's still the same court. In other words, that court, it has to have its roots from the Torah for it to be binding on all of Israel. So just in that area, I think we disagree.
I do agree that there was a court, but because I didn't live it, so I didn't see firsthand, I cannot say whether, look, I could say in a opinion, like maybe within belief, that the court that was established at Mount Sinai kept the great tradition all the way till the Second Temple times. I could say that as a belief, but it's not a mandatory belief, and I personally don't believe it because I have no factual evidence of archaeology to see that it's true. So it's only my opinion that whatever the courts were before Babylon, I don't know how they ruled besides what it says in Scripture, meaning primarily on disagreements between Jewish law. But what we do know from archaeology can only go back to the time of Ezra. So that's what I know for sure.
I'm pretty sure that there's no historical evidence for Ezra's court either. Ezra's temple wasn't even the same temple as Herod's temple. Herod
Yes, that's true.
renovated the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah helped build. But the Torah itself tells us that they will judge from the place that I will choose. And in Hebrew, this is called the Lishkat HaGazit, the room of hewn stones on top of the temple. This court only has authority through a system called smicha that's passed down from teacher to student. God tells Moses, I'm going to put on them what I put on you. And then Moses even gives smicha to Yehoshua, and on and on. So you believe also in faith, because there's no historical evidence of a court ruling on the Temple Mount in the time of Ezra, because we don't really have remnants. It's hard for you to say that you believe in that and not in the court that appears in 2 Chronicles chapter 19 or in Deuteronomy chapter 17. It has to be a straight line.
I
mean, do you make a distinction?
And that's why, but I don't know how they rule. That's my distinction. I fully admit that there were courts because Scripture says outright there were courts. And on the question of smicha, well, that's when the what was it called? The academies within Jerusalem were banded because smicha was never given to the Babylonian study academies, and for all of the medieval ages, no one was called rabbi until the Ramak reinstated smicha with 3 other Kabbalists to make smicha a thing again.
The Mary Rav. He was a rabbi in Sfat.
And 2 others all agreed to be the first people to have shmicha in over almost 1,000 years.
They received it first, but the person who instituted it was the Mari Rav in 1538 in Sfat. In terms of smicha disappearing, it really disappeared in 300 of the Common Era. The last person to have smicha, or at least one of the last persons, was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi.
Yep.
But the reason these guys held any power is because they claimed to have an unbroken succession of tradition going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. But it didn't really begin with Ezra. I mean, mind you.
I don't question that their authority goes back to their ancestors. I fully accept that from the time of Mount Sinai till we got the Mishnah, there is a line of authority granted to the others. I do not believe that they all have the same opinions as constant, especially when you have the big divide between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. But just because they are human beings and so they have different opinions doesn't mean that they don't have authority, because they must have authority, and that authority is stated quite clearly in Deuteronomy.
I think you're reiterating what I'm saying. I believe that these rabbis have authority because of this smicha process, that they could link back. Parkarvot and the Rambam in his Hakdamat to the Mishnah Torah links it back to Moshe Rabbeinu. But in terms of Ezra and what Ezra instituted, I think we only have a handful of his actual rulings, and it has to do with reading of the Torah, with Takanas Ezra, and a handful of other things. In other words, it's still just faith that we believe that these men are a continuation of the elders that appear in Deuteronomy 17. It's ultimately all faith.
That is the point of religion. It's all faith. It's something.
Absolutely. All right, so where do you and I differ?
Well, as I discussed before we did the interview, my main difference, which gets me into a lot of trouble, but I see it because it's how the Tanakh was created, was the only authoritative books is the Torah and the prophets. The writings, which I do enjoy reading the writings, are not authoritative because they were compiled at the very end of the Second Temple during the time of the Mishnah. While during the time of the Second Temple, the canon was very absolute. You had the Torah, and then you had the books of the prophets. And I view the prophets as being, because they are prophets, and so I have faith in prophecy being true, because of Deuteronomy 18 saying that we need to listen to them, that they clarify theological issues and helps us understand concepts within the Torah that are left vague intentionally and then clarified through the words of the prophets.
The Torah doesn't state that the job of the prophet is to clarify theological issues. It says that about the court in Deuteronomy chapter 17.
Well, it does in
and
chapter 18,
in terms of
say that you should listen to them so you do not stray from these foreign gods. But that's the exact phrase, meaning clarifying belief so they do not believe incorrectly. Because we do know throughout the Torah, it says, do not.
I'm not saying they don't. Hold on. If you go to the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 18, it speaks about Israel emulating the nations around them, and then when they do, God says that I will raise up for you a prophet. In other words, He only sends prophets to Israel when Israel begins to stray, to bring them back to Torah. But it doesn't say they institute or clarify doctrine or Torah. Their job is to bring the people back to Torah. As a matter of fact, the prophet is also forbidden from adding to the Torah, so whether it's theologically or even legally, unless the prophets, as the Rambam mentions, actually sat on the Sanhedrin, because Per Kavod also links all the major prophets that appear in Tanakh as having their own court and also having smicha. But in terms of the job of the prophet is to clarify theological issues that appears nowhere in Torah, it sounds like you're quoting the 13 principles of faith by stating that we believe prophecy is true. Now, the Rambam there is not saying that we believe that the books of the prophets are without error. I also don't believe that there's errors in the books of the prophet, but what he's saying is a statement of faith that we believe that prophecy is true, that when God raises up a prophet, that his words are true. But to use the books of the prophets like an almanac for things to come, or like a legend or a guide to try to understand what Torah is trying to tell us, that appears nowhere in the Torah, because that would be almost like adding to the Torah, because the prophet could just say, I'm bringing the final interpretation of what the Torah really means, and that's pretty much what Muhammad did. So I view the books of the prophets as historical, as a historical account of the life and times of those prophets and how God acted throughout history. But they're not there to clarify theological issues. As a matter of fact, why would God even punish Israel if there was a misunderstanding on an ambiguous portion in Torah? In other words, it seems like it would be God's fault. God brings prophets to Israel to just bring them back to Torah and to the judges of those times who instituted civil law. But do you have an example of a prophet that clarified a Torah commandment?
Well, not commandment, because that's the job of the Sanhedrin and all the courts. But I do have a great example of a theological issue that was clarified purely by the prophets. But before I say that, I do want to mention that I am not using the 13 principles of faith by Maimonides, because there have been other principles of faith from different sages, and so I don't consider that principle, list of principles, to be absolute. But now going back to the example of when a prophet has clarified something, the most blatant one is in, Ezekiel chapter 18, the entire chapter. It starts with, why do you people say that you eat the grapes, but the children get the bad result from it? I believe sour is the word used. And then later on, it's a detailed explanation of, no, you will be responsible for your own sins, period. And if you are sinful, if you decide to do my commandments, then in God's eyes, because it says it explicitly, then you will be righteous and as if you never committed sin. And then for the righteous man, if he commits sin even once, then all of his righteousness shall be taken away, and he will be viewed as purely a sinner. And the reasoning behind this, because God does say, why do you say this is unjust? He says, well, you are unjust for saying that people are responsible for their sins. Well, the responsibility of their sins go down to the generations, which is also confirmed by Jeremiah and also within Deuteronomy, where it says, you shall be punished for your own sins. But it's only within this chapter of Ezekiel that we understand, Okay, how does God actually judge us? Because, well, within the Torah, it never actually says the methodology that God judges, except right here, and this is the only instance where it just explains it all.
It's clear how God judges you in Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, 29, and Leviticus 26, that when you begin to stray, God sends you prophetic intervention, which is Deuteronomy 18, and if you don't listen to that prophet, he kicks you out and then only brings you back after you repent. In other words, there is no notion...
I'm mainly talking about the individual, because the individual is the subject of Ezekiel 18, where it's not talking about the nation, because we know emphatically through the Torah how the nation is going to be judged. That's obvious. We don't know ever how God judges an individual. And this is the only section within the whole Tanakh that says that if you are wicked, you starting to keep the commandments will be within God's eyes. That's what it says literally. Of God's eyes, you will be sinless, which is such a crazy understanding of justice. But this is our God, and this is the justice He's presenting.
So the Torah
has nothing to do with the law, but purely to do with theology. Because how God judges people is not the law. The law is concerned to what we do, not what God does.
Right. So the Torah is not preoccupied with a afterlife that one should even care how God judges you. The Torah speaks about the nation as a whole, and clearly the nation is made up of individuals. So if 90% of the nation is wicked, they'll go into exile, even with the 10% who are righteous. So being that the Torah is not, like I said, preoccupied with heaven and hell, this is why it doesn't mention anything about how God judges the individual. And first of all, that portion in Ezekiel does not speak about the individual. It's speaking about the nation, because Ezekiel is called to prophesy towards Israel when they were already in Babylon. And it appears in Ezekiel 37. It lays out what he was there to do, to bring back the dead. In other words, Israel, who were pretty much dead in their sins, and then God says, prophesy or speak to these bones. And this is an analogy of them listening to the message of Ezekiel, changing their behavior, repenting, and then God bringing them back to life in a hyperbolic fashion. So I'm not sure where you got the connection that it's speaking about the individual. Now, there are instances in the Torah that speaks about how God punishes the sins of a father on the children for many generations. But there's a distinction between how God judges people and how the Sanhedrin judges people.
But I do want to do a quick intercession by saying I completely agree with the analogy of the dry bones being the whole nation of Israel. It's explicit. The reason why I say it's the individual, because within this chapter, God gives the very, very detailed examples of one person being a father, another person being a son, and how they're acting, and then how their actions affect the other. God goes out of his way within this one chapter to really, really hone in the individual aspect and not really go in a general form whatsoever. That's the only reason why I see it as an individual thing, because reading the text
have nothing to say to the individual Israelites. The job of the prophet is to be all of Israel to bring them back. Now, Christianity reinterprets virtually every statement made by the prophets to be accepted on an individual level for a personal salvation. But this is not the Jewish mindset.
Christianity. Yeah.
Right, but it seems that that's what you're dragging Judaism. Okay. So it sounds like you're dragging Judaism to this fallacy as well. In other words, the destination of your soul, i.e. caring what God thinks about the individual, was not in the mind of the average Israelite, at least with how we see them behave in Torah. Now, clearly, God does interact with people in Tanakh, right? I mean, King David and the whole story.
It has nothing to do with the soul, though. It's saying, if you're wicked, you're going to die, and if you're not, you'll live a long life. It's not saying anything about the afterlife. The Torah is so blatantly not talking about the afterlife that I personally have no clue what the afterlife is, and so I do not even try to ponder it. The reason why I bring...
It's your interpretation, only your interpretation, to say that this is talking about the individual, because he would really be superseding his job as the prophet to deal with individual sin instead of collective sins of the nation. So whenever a prophet speaks to Israel, he's speaking to the people in general. Now, surely the nation is made up of individuals, but to say that this is in some way shedding light on how God deals with the individual, it's really creative reading. Now, I have no problem assuming that God judges the individual in a similar fashion to him judging all of Israel. But to say that this specifically is giving us insight or adding theology or explaining the Torah from an authoritative fashion is almost adding to the Torah, because the Torah doesn't say that. Now, clearly, God is not pleased with people who sin. And just like God punishes the nation as a whole, I believe that within every mitzvah, there's the punishment for not keeping that mitzvah. But I don't think that makes the case that the prophets are in some way shedding light or adding theology or interpreting the words of the Torah for us in an authoritative manner, because that's almost like adding to the Torah.
Adding to the Torah. Because adding to the Torah, normally, according to all the rabbis I've ever known, it's just adding to scriptural commandments. Adding to the Torah or subtracting it from the Torah has never been about theological issues. This is the first time I ever heard any rabbi state that adding to the Torah is something with theology. It's always been the law. And we know that the law must be upheld, and that's what the prophet's primary job is, to keep the law perfect and get Israel back to following the law. But adding to the Torah and subtracting to the Torah has nothing to do with theological issues. It really doesn't, because it's never clarified to be with that. It says, you shall not add on to the law, meaning you shall not change these commandments and create new commandments upon yourselves. That's what the Torah says. It never says anything about theology.
The notion of being a Baal Tosif also includes things like, how do you please God? How does one get redeemed? The Torah has authority in theology. And if someone adds to that theology, assuming that God has partners, you wouldn't consider that adding?
No.
I mean, that's clearly a theological issue.
Because here's the thing. If you're clarifying a point of confusion, and the opening passage about this specific text, because we could talk about other passages as well, but this specific text is addressing a confusion. This confusion of the saying, the fathers will eat the grapes and the children's mouths will be sour. They'll be rotten.
Where does it say that it's clarifying a statement of confusion? You're saying that.
No.
But where's the confusion?
He says, no longer shall you say this statement. That's what the wording says. It says, no longer shall you say this statement. Instead, here is how I judge. That's what the whole chapter is about. Denying that statement should ever be said.
But what's it clarifying? According to the Torah, what Torah statement is it clarifying? Or what Torah idea is it clarifying? Or is it a social construct that it's responding to? How do you consider this an interpretation of something that's gray or dark in Torah?
Well, because of the two instances of when the Torah does say God will punish unto the third and fourth generation, and then God will reward to the 1,000th generation. And then within Deuteronomy, it says God will judge you on a personal level for your sins. There has been, according to the text of the prophets, a misconception of these two verses, making the confusion. And that's why Maimonides says quite emphatically that one of the punishments, if you are a sinner, is that your children shall be punished and die, because children are property until a certain age, which is why King David had his baby die. Like, that is explicitly stated within the...
In the 10 statements, it talks about God remembers, but in Hebrew there, it could also mean visits or repays. Someone sins on later generations, and it says, for those who hate me. But that's apart from what's incumbent of the Sanhedrin not to adjudicate children for the sins of their fathers. But where's the clarification?
The whole word clarification, the definition of clarification means nothing is being changed and nothing is being added on to. It's just a more better understanding of something. It's not, like, I don't know why you think clarification is such a dirty word, because it sounds like you think clarification means I'm going to replace things, when that's not what clarification means at all. Because
you're contradicting a statement in the Torah. The statement in the Torah says that God punishes the children ultimately for the sins of the parents for so many generations. That's clear-cut in the Torah. Now you're saying that Ezekiel is saying that this is no longer going to happen, correct?
No, Ezekiel does not say that. He's quoting from Deuteronomy, just like Jeremiah quotes from Deuteronomy, saying that the sins of the individual shall be the ones that are punishable.
But didn't you say that the Torah says the Almighty punishes children and even whole generations for the sins of one person or the sins of their parents? But now Ezekiel is saying that he's no longer going to do that, correct?
No. Ezekiel never says God is changing his mind, saying he's doing something different. That's what you are misunderstanding.
So where's the clarification then?
The clarification is when in Deuteronomy it says that the individual shall be punished for his sins. That clarification is also said within Jeremiah, because the generation punishment is for the whole nation and not for the individual.
The notion of God forgiving the sins of individuals is not a Torah concept to begin with.
All right, well, I'll give a great example. In many of the books of the prophets, there's a quotation saying, I do not care for your sacrifices. I do not care for your festivals. I care for you to follow the moral commandments. And that's from Amos, Hosea, Micah. Many, many prophets say this phrase.
Right, if you don't keep the moral law.
Correct. That's the point.
Yeah, but it sounds like you're, okay.
Because you asked
so this is not anything new.
Clarifications. Yes. I'm not saying prophets...
That needs to be clarified, that if people only keep ceremonial laws without any ethical intent or without having moral values, that clearly those ceremonial laws mean nothing to God. This has to be clarified?
Yes, it does. Seeing within the context of these prophets, the nation of Israel and Judah were doing sacrifices constantly.
That's not a theological clarification.
That's not.
I mean, it seems... Do you believe that God makes a distinction between ceremonial law and ethical law?
Does he make a direct distinction?
In God's mind.
He does, according to the words of the prophets. Now, if the prophets are wrong...
According to the Torah itself.
Well, where does it say in Torah exactly that God views morality more important than sacrifices?
By the simple fact that God said that he himself, with the whole nation of Israel, if they violated 3 particular commands, and those commands are not ceremonial in any way, and that's mistreating the stranger, the orphan, or the widow. It really would make God a moral idiot to make no distinction between shotness and murder. If you really think that the children of Israel needed a prophet to tell them that immoral behavior was on a different level than ceremonial behavior, it sounds like you don't think much of the children of Israel.
The only reason why I say that is because Amos says it explicitly. Why do you sell your brethren into slavery and then do all these sacrifices? Then in the other prophets, they address the same issue. So it's not me having a poor opinion of our ancestors. No. I'm just reading what the text says.
The books of the prophets are a historical account of what these prophets said to Israel. These prophets were speaking about...
nothing. Why do we have them at all recorded? What's the point?
They're historical books. Only because we have historical books doesn't mean that these books...
Because Chronicles
all right.
and
you're saying
books are in writings, and those are historical books, while Kings and Samuel are prophet books. So there is a giant distinction between what is just a historical book and what is a prophet. So you
there is no distinction.
These are historical only. Yes,
why
would Chronicles be in the section of the writings?
You can't understand the books of the prophets without reading it alongside the books of the writings, the historical book of the writings, because 9 out of 10 times, every prophecy made in the books of the prophets coincides with the story in the books of the writings. And the Talmud clearly states, I believe in Masechet Sanhedrin, that it was Hezekiah and his court who wrote books of the prophets and the books of the writings. In other words, you're telling me that all the way till Hezekiah, and really in some canonized form post-Ezra, all these theological ideas came alive because the Jews never had these books in their possession.
In other words, no. According to Malachi, there has always been a righteous remnant.
These books didn't exist.
The truth. And clarification does need something, like you need clarification when the people go astray. That's the point of the prophets. The prophets are not there to change things. I said clarify. Clarify has nothing to do with change. You got to get that out of your mind. Because
the Talmud is clear that if Israel would never have sinned on that level to be exiled, we would never have any of the books of the prophets. In other words, the job of the prophet was only to speak to the specific generations that were either already in exile or about to go into exile. It was never understood that these books were a compendium to what appears in the 5 books of Moses to clarify or anything, because we have a Sanhedrin for this. From a devotional level, you're reading the books of the prophets like it's out there to speak to you on a devotional level, but that's not the idea of Hezekiah's court and the men of the great assembly.
Had nothing to do with the individual. The majority of the prophets...
None of the prophets had to do with the individual. Every prophet had to do only with the nation.
Yes, the majority do, and even within Ezekiel, he's dealing with mainly the nation and all these things. Look, I'm not the one who
On the validity,
Yeah, what is it?
on how trustworthy what the book of Ezekiel is, the sages in the Talmud clearly say that we're limited what haftarot that we could extract from it, because there was a debate on whether that book was holy at all, because it gives different measurements.
Yeah, because I completely agree, because that is a stunt, and the reasoning was because there seemed to be different Jewish law that was being created by Ezekiel, because the book does make different measurements of the temple and all these things. But then
inaccurate measurements. In other words, these were historical books. They weren't books to introduce theology. No Jew walked around saying, because we have a statement in Isaiah or Ezekiel, this in some way clarifies or explains a silent or gray theological area in the Torah. That's never been said in the Talmud anywhere. Now, I know you believe this in faith, and fine. I mean, I have no problem. I don't think it's a huge conflict of interest, but I think in the long run,
no conflict whatsoever.
I'm saying I personally believe there's no conflict of interest. However, in the Torah itself, although it tells us to listen to the prophets when God, in His mercy, uses them to try to bring us back to Torah, it never says to write down prophecies as some sort of almanac or some sort of study guide to understand the words of God. As a matter of fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, He specifically says that the secret things in the Torah are for God Himself, and only the revealed things are for us and our children to do. So to say that He's...
Because I use it all the time to justify the prophets. Because the revealed things, well, what is being revealed? Prophets are to reveal. That the very definition of it.
Deuteronomy chapter 18 is the only statement that tells us to listen to prophets. It's the only chapter
and the only
that covered this issue.
To listen to the judges is Deuteronomy 17 towards the end. That's the only statement ever to listen to the judges in the whole Torah. So saying that because the prophets were only mentioned once to be listened to, well, if we're going to use that as that not being important, so because the judges are only mentioned once within all the Torah to say, listen to their rulings.
The judges are mentioned more than once. It appears in Deuteronomy chapter 1, also in Numbers with the establishment of the court. In terms of the actual mitzvah, the mitzvah of lo tasur, yes, is in Parshat Shoftim. And the mitzvah to listen to a prophet is only linked to that chapter that mentions that God will send us prophets when we begin to emulate the nations that we've displaced. And that's it. In other words, that they will bring you back to Torah, not that they will amplify or clarify what Torah really means. Like if Israel needed clarification, God would be an unjust God to allow Israel to go into exile because the Torah, in terms of ethical matters or theological matters, wasn't clear enough to understand on its own. Do you understand how illogical that sounds?
On its own. No, it is clear. The prophets had never been there to say the Torah isn't clear. The prophets are just reiterating what the Torah says. But first, before I lose my train of thought, I do have a very sincere question. What is your view of the day of Adonai, the big judgment, with all of these prophets saying descriptions of these things on the day of the Lord, as the Christians would like to say? Like, are these meaningless verses, or like I sincerely want to hear your opinion on these prophecies that are for the Messianic age. Like, do we listen to them on that?
No.
We shouldn't listen. Wow, then the majority of the world will not agree with you. These are the details of the Messianic age.
Pretty sure that you agree that every prophecy is conditional, and every prophecy of blessing or of cursing in the lifetime of that prophet had to do with Israel's exile, where they were probably prophesying from. Wait, hold on one second. Their exile and their ultimate redemption. In other words, there's a lot of hyperbolic language used about how God would ultimately redeem Israel. And that is what has been mistranslated as some messianic age. If that's a criteria you're going to use, that rabbis would disagree with me. I mean, rabbis also extract ideas like Gilgal and Techiyat HaMeitim from the prophets when it's not even there. So that's definitely a bad criteria. The prophets, every time they mention impending doom or an age of peace where everyone will have knowledge of God, all they're speaking about is Israel in a redeemed, elevated state, or Israel being exiled to the four corners of the world at that time. That's it. So in terms of the day of judgment, I think you're referring to Parshat Nitzavim, that God judges everyone, in this statement, I believe, on an individual level after they die. That's the day of judgment. That everyone is going to have to give an account for their sins after this life. Now, the Torah itself doesn't specify what the actual afterlife is, or even if there is one, to what extent, okay, that's fine. I don't think the Torah requires me to believe in an afterlife, but that's how okay, fine. I mean, you make these statements like, okay.
I study the Torah constantly. I read it every single day, and maybe it may sound humorous, but I don't mean it as to show off. I'm just saying as I agree with you, because from what I read and what I remember, because I read it so many times, that's just saying something that is true. So I don't mean it as an arrogance. I just want to say that this is a point that we do agree, and so we can clarify the specifics of where we don't agree. It says nothing about resurrection, and the prophets say nothing about resurrection except for the bones, but that's for the nation of Israel being renewed, not for actual resurrection. The only mention of resurrection ever is in Daniel. That's even within writings, and that has so many contradictory statements with the Torah that I don't view Daniel as being anywhere near authoritative. There are
well, Daniel chapter 12 is just a reiteration of Ezekiel chapter 37.
No, it's not. Because I have never heard a rabbi say the very ending of chapter 12 that when the angel Michael, which is the first time ever an angel is named within the whole Tanakh, is going to wake up the dead and bring them all coming forth.
In terms of the resurrection of the dead, it's symbolic.
I think it is symbolic, but not because of
I think that you misunderstood what I said. Daniel was a contemporary of Ezekiel. Daniel chapter 12 is just reiterating the whole narrative of the two sticks in the valley of the dry bones that appears in Ezekiel 37. In other words, being brought from death to life, or some for everlasting contempt, and I'm sure you know that leolam, what doesn't necessarily mean everlasting, but just a long time. It's really an analogy to Israel being redeemed, or Israel staying in Babylon, like we believe that 60% of them actually did. So this is how Ezekiel 37 ties into Daniel chapter 12.
In terms of interpretation, it's the first time I heard it, but I do like it. I see nothing wrong with it.
Till now, you haven't really given me an example of some insight brought by the prophets that could not have already been understood or unraveled by the average reader of the Torah.
All right, well, how about this? And this will be my last example, and if this doesn't work, I'm sorry to waste your time. But the book of Habakkuk, 2nd chapter, where God is saying, write this down on a tablet, because this is what I'm going to say to you. And so he says, why exactly are the Babylonians going to conquer Judah? And the whole explanation is, well, God uses nations to conquer and to give divine punishment, but they will also be conquered as well, because all of the wicked nations will eventually have to be conquered. And within this...
Wait. There's no statement in the prophets that says that every nation that conquers Israel is going to be conquered.
Well, actually, whenever, there's Joel, there's a lot of prophets who say that there will be a reckoning, a final day, where all the nations who have been against Israel shall be destroyed. And
But again, Joel, Haggai, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, where they were speaking at a specific time, these nations that they're speaking about are nations like Assyria, nations like even Babylon, who may have overly mistreated Israel.
I'm not saying that in the future this is going to happen. I'm saying specifically with Habakkuk, he's saying Babylon shall be punished, but right now in this instant, Babylon shall conquer you. That's what the text is saying. The underlining lesson, though, because it is a lesson, is that God uses his foreign nations to give out judgment. In the future, I have no clue.
It says it's in Torah, by the way.
Where does it say in Torah?
Towards the end of Deuteronomy, from 26 to 30, it says that God will rejoice as the nations overtake you. But I know Rashi takes it and flips it upside down and says that he's only going to rejoice when the nations are destroyed, which is why I'm not a big fan of studying the Chumash for Rashi. But clearly, God uses the nations to displace Israel. How can you understand it any other way? The whole Tochacha is about Israel being led away, being put on slave ships. Who's doing this but the other nations? But why do you think that you need a prophet to tell you that this is other nations doing this?
Well, because the question within Habakkuk is, why exactly is a wickeder nation? Because Habakkuk says, yes, Judah and Israel are wicked. But why is a nation even more wicked than us, the ones who are punishing us? That's the question from chapter 1. And then chapter 2 answers the question. Now, that question is never raised within Torah. But
that's not a theological insight. Hold on. Yeah. If you understand the prophets, at least in the way I understand it, that the prophet is speaking to a specific people at a specific time. So if they ask the prophet, why is this happening now? When the prophet is responding to this, he's speaking about the there at that time, not as a theological rule to in some way attach it to every exile. So what you're doing is setting yourself up by trying to apply this new theological understanding that you think was revealed to you by the prophets and applying it at some future time and it not lining up, and then you dropping the whole system because you found a crack in your theological framework. In other words, if you just stick to the Torah, I have no doubt you would come to the same conclusion.
I think the prophets are to help you come to the same conclusion. Like, I think we're fighting on a misconception. I do believe that the Torah is all you need to understand theology. But I also view specifically the books of the prophets to be reiterating them and giving you historical
Oh, that's a different thing. Hold on. I also believe that. It's reiterating Torah principles.
We spent the last half an hour just...
No, but you're saying that it's almost like a necessary companion to the Torah to understand theological issues.
Yes, and the reasoning is this. I'm going to make it very, very technical and explain the best I can. These ideas are within the Torah, yes, especially when we look at how God says, if you keep my commandments, you will get all these blessings, and if you don't keep them, you'll get all these curses. The reason why I say it elaborates, not adding on to, is simply because with the prophets, you get to see these promises that the Torah states actually happen to our people. So you're getting more visual, exact examples. And that's the clarification. It's not clarifying.
Yeah, we're tied to specific situations again.
Yes.
These prophets were speaking about specific situations.
Yes, but those specific situations were a enforcement of what was promised within Torah.
You're saying that we should read it like a rule. We should read a statement that a prophet made as a rule for all eternity on how God acts every time.
Never said
For
that.
example, so you don't believe that the books of the prophets are necessary as a guide to understanding theology that appears in the Torah?
No, I don't believe that. The best analogy is this. In algebra, you have theories. But to get a better grasp of these theories, you have to do problems. So with the Torah, it gives you the theology, and then the prophets shows you the examples of the theology being fulfilled. That's
for that specific time.
Yeah,
for that specific exile. All right, so then it's not explaining the Torah for all generations. It's explaining a historical event and how God acted within that historical event and why he acted.
That is by showing these examples of the actual implications, because the Torah says what's going to happen through the theological claims of the punishments for not keeping the commandments. But that's just saying it. It's only within the prophets do we see these punishments actually occur. And I think that's a great thing for human beings to actually see the implications and not just know the theology.
What correlation do you see between the first exile to Babylon for 70 years and the Roman exile?
I love this question so much because so many Christians ask me it, and it's quite easy to show, especially within the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, because they give a description of a future exile, one past the Babylonian one, where you'll be scattered through all the nations to a land that you do not know the tongue of, which is clearly not the Babylonians because they spoke Aramaic, and that was the spoken language towards the end of the period of Judah, because we know that through the book of Kings. The second exile, a lot of the prophets from Hosea and Amos and a lot of them, they have this phrase of, and God will bring you back from all the corners of the earth, and you will be under the Davidic king, and you will all say that we will follow God's laws. And this seems, especially within Jeremiah, because Jeremiah has an initial prophecy about the Babylonian exile, but then he has a second one that sounds very similar, but clearly the context is not within the first Babylonian exile, but for a second exile that's much greater and longer. And all the other prophets make it vague enough to say that it's not talking specifically about the Babylonians, because the implications they're giving is these will be generations long and not just 70 years.
Mm-hmm. So the way the rabbis understood those passages was tying it to Israel's first exile, which wasn't the Babylonian exile. It was the Assyrian exile of the northern kingdoms. And they believe that Jeremiah
fulfill this prophecy by bringing a bunch of them back in the time of King Josiah. But this idea of some sort of perpetual or for a very long time would contradict free will. In other words, to believe that prophecies are not conditional and saying that we were destined to be in Galut for a long time, it would contradict the rules of understanding the prophets, that whenever a prophet makes a statement, it's not a definitive statement. If it's a curse, it's a warning, and if it's a prophetic statement of blessing, it's a promise, but it's conditional always.
Maimonides says that explicitly, where he describes what a prophet is, and he says negative prophecies can be reversed through repentance, and that's purely from the book of Jonah, because Jonah gets upset, doesn't get punished.
Not from Jonah. At the end of Deuteronomy and at the end of Leviticus, God gives us the formula for exile and redemption.
But
that's
he's
all.
Talking specifically about negative commandments being not, the negative prophecy being not approved for a prophet not being a true prophet. The only test for a true prophet is if a positive commandment is said and then it's fulfilled. Cannot judge it the negative, and that's purely a Jonah. Now, if there's a exact thing within the Torah, I never read it, but with Jonah, it's the whole story is about how negative prophecies can be prevented through repentance.
God laid down the formula in the Torah. People nowadays colloquially call it prophecies, some sort of decree that came from heaven, but that only has to do with the timeline, not the punishment. The Torah clearly says if you do such and such, as a people, God will exile you, and God, if you repent, will bring you back to the land of Israel. That's a formula. It's not a prophecy. In other words, it was no surprise to the children of Israel when they had their temple destroyed for worshiping idols or not keeping the Shemitah year.